all for the topic, or for me, I don't know, we'll find out gradually. But the topic of today, and I'll have one more topic for tomorrow, I understand, is Knowledge is Power Revisited, Internet and Democracy. Now, when I was preparing for this presentation, I thought of downloading a couple of videos and fragments from the internet. I use my Facebook. Who of you doesn't have it's a ridiculous question. You probably don't have a Facebook site because the Chinese government has blocked Facebook, I understand. I use my Facebook as a Chinese wall, in that sense that I invite my students to contribute to the discussions we have and to post issues on the Facebook so that we can use it as an interactive kind of social network. And so, as I was saying, I tried to download a couple of those things which are on my Facebook, and if you ever have access to it, you're most welcome to become my friend. A simple email will do. But unfortunately, none of this is possible here, and therefore I'm afraid I can't show you what I intended to show you. A couple of things which are better to be explained while watching a video rather than me listening to me being a bit boring and elaborate in theoretical ways. So I apologize for that part. My presentation is an attempt to present you with a number of questions to which I sometimes don't have the right answer or any answer at all. So it's not that you have to take everything I say as the gospel or as the truth. I'm trying to give you a couple of ways of looking at the problem of internet and democracy, and there is, I'm afraid, not one way which is the right way. It's a perspective which tries to identify a couple of positive but also negative points related to the internet and social networking these days. How am I doing here? Can you follow me? Is this the right tempo for you to understand?
Yes. Yeah.
Again, I'm impressed. I know that lecturing is normally a one-way process. I try to turn it into an interactive process. So if some of you have a question, if some of you want to interrupt for clarifications or things that you disagree with, please do. Just raise your hand and we will stop wherever we are and try to address your concerns or your questions. That is much more productive than listening to me for 45 minutes, an hour, and then walk away with what has he said or what is the meaning of what he has to contribute. So let's try to make it a bit interactive given the circumstances that is. Okay, I would like to start with a quote which is probably a bit difficult to read in the back of the room. Let me also say from the beginning, I will make this PowerPoint available to whoever coordinates this, so it will stay here at the university and you can always download it or use it for your own purposes. So you don't really have to copy everything which is available on the screen. But I start with a quote by Indrajit Banerjee, a name who is probably not familiar to you. He happens to be the Director General of AMIC. AMIC stands for Asian Media and Information Center. It's the research institute where most of the research in Asia, in the totality of Asia is being coordinated or centralized. And they published a book some years ago, 2003, where they addressed the issue of Internet for Asia. What is the future of the Internet for Asia? And I just take a quote, a reference from that book to introduce the topic today. I will read it. Asia is still discovering the Internet and issues of access in a larger sense of the term of censorship and regulation. Censorship and regulation. And of depoliticization and self-censorship still restrict the political impact of the Internet in Asia. So right from the beginning, this person, who is an Asian himself and originally from India, he points at the problems Internet poses for countries in the Asian region. The relative immaturity of Asian democracies themselves constitute an important impediment to greater public and political debate, participation and the promotion of civil and political liberties. I assume that that's all known to you, or at least you can associate with this. You, given the example I used at the beginning, the fact that your government still tries to block certain access to the Internet for certain sites, etc., is in a way an illustration of what is stated here. It gives you less freedom, less opportunities than you would have if you would be fully, what shall I use as a word, liberalized, democratized. You can complete it for yourself. Notwithstanding these limitations, the Internet has to a limited extent provided for an expanded political and public sphere and the voicing of alternative political views. So while on the one hand there is still that problem with Asian democracies and Internet access, on the other hand it has definitely also opened opportunities for people like you, opportunities which were not there in the past. So you can look at it from a positive, but also still from a more restrictive, negative perspective. In a context where the mass media have often been strictly controlled by the state, the Internet offers a new channel of communication, a new voice, a new hope for those who have been marginalized and prevented from participating in the political process. I think that that's what's going on these days in many Asian countries, including your own, where there is still that reluctance by the government to open all the airwaves and communication channels, and on the other hand the pressure coming from people like you who would like to see much more happening and more freedom coming to your country. Again, freedom is a very tricky word and it has to be properly defined. We will hopefully come to that in a minute. So by starting this introduction, this presentation with a quote from an Asian, I hope that I don't frustrate or offend any of you. It's not me who makes this statement, it's a fellow Asian who comes to the table and observes this. In the ongoing presentation, I will now also add a few more points which I consider important in this debate. One starting point, I have listed it under in total 14 points. So I want to address this issue by looking at it in a number of ways, in total 14 ways of looking at the same problem. As I said, not all the perspectives are positive, not all of them are negative. It's a mix, and I think that that's what is going on at the moment. You cannot come up with a balanced opinion, a balanced assessment, if you only look at it in a very positive way. There are positive events, there are positive outcomes, but there is unfortunately also something to be worried about. So the first point I want to make is what, further elaborating on that statement of Banerjee, what is democracy in Asia? First of all, there is not something like one democracy in Asia. Every country, every society, every community has its own ways of dealing with these topics, and that's definitely what one can observe from a distance. And therefore, the first point here is a variety of systems and models ranging from authoritarian to relatively developed democratic systems. I leave it up to you to define where China fits in. Whether it's still on the one end or on the other end, that's a discussion you may have. I don't really need to make that judgment or to make that option. Policies related to ICTs, to information and communication technologies, have always been sensitive, even before the age of the internet, because media, mass media, broadcasting media, newspapers, print, they have always played a specific role in any kind of society, also in the history of China, the Chinese society. And they have always been handled in a politically sensitive way. So there is nothing new under the sun in that regard. Governments have always tried to control, to influence, to manipulate the role of media. Now it has improved or increased in the sense that it's now very obvious if one blocks access to social networks, that's something everybody immediately notices. In the past, the influence may have been more subtle at the level of newsrooms, at the level of agenda setting. Nowadays, everybody can observe it when one accesses the internet and sees that one doesn't have access to all the facilities, all the websites which are there somewhere. So a question which comes from that general first statement is there a correlation between the internet and democratization? In other words, would it indeed mean that more internet access, more freedom of airwaves would lead to more democratization? Any opinion about that?
Yeah.
Yes. Indeed, Westerners would argue that more freedom leads to more democratization. There are people, theorists and practical practitioners who might, in other parts of the world and even in the West, who might have a bit of a more balanced and reluctant kind of answer than yes, because they might see the loopholes in that kind of correlation, or they may conclude that there is no correlation, that the fact that you have access to things does not automatically mean that you also will move towards a more democratic society. It's, from that perspective, probably more important that you not only have access, that the media are free, but that you can also freely participate in the media. And once again, traditionally, media have always played a very exclusive role in society. They have created a status for themselves, and they normally report to you. They don't report with you or for you. They just make you, they give you information, they open up certain broad areas of news which they think are important to all of us. But if we would really discuss this among ourselves, we might conclude that what is available on the news is not necessarily of interest to me. I might have other interests. So, to stay to the point here, access, as it is often being promoted in the West, is not necessarily a guarantee for more democratization. You may need more than just access when you are looking at the correlation between internet availability and democratization. Anybody who wants to, please?
I'd like to just say that access to ITC and information can give you the knowledge to make informative decisions, which then can lead to some form of democracy, amongst the people.
Yes, but she says that access to information may lead to higher levels of democratization. I think the most important word you use is may, not will or should lead. And that's precisely the point I was making.
The people can make informative decisions if
Right.
they do educate themselves and therefore having access to ITC. Oh, by the way, I'm from Papua New Guinea. I'm from the Pacific, and we're quite new to the ITC wave,
Right.
the internet. We're just getting a handle of it. And in a country where less than 80% are literate, they don't even have access to computers. Maybe there's a small portion of it having access to that. And this is why I come to China. This is all about my research.
Right.
Thank you, Ad.
Okay, so I think that the point you're making will be fine-tuned and addressed in a more detailed way through my presentation. So if you bear with me, I'll continue with the second point I want to make. And that again is a general point, from scarcity to overload and inequality. My argument here is that each historical period has had a particular problem to solve. In the past, the problems were very material: poverty, malnutrition, lack of enough food for everybody. And as a result, that got solved through the improvement of agricultural means, the emphasis on better crop cultivation, etc. Then we had the period that the industrialization was a major issue and an important point. Nowadays it seems as if information needs need to be addressed. So each epoch, each historical period comes with its own forms of scarcity, resulting in sometimes overload, abundance of something. And in the second point I make, I qualify that in each epoch, initial problems of scarcity, hunger, poverty, information poverty, have been taken over by more sophisticated structural problems: overabundance, pollution and waste, extreme wealth and information overload, inequality, ecological, economic, educative, cultural, and digital and other divides. So we have to be careful that we always welcome new things from a positive perspective only. We may have to have and to address this in more balanced ways. I just met one of your professors in environmental science, and he explained me the new environmental policies of your government, or at least what's going on in the province of Hubei. And he said that China is now reconsidering its growth policies, because it has come to the realization that growth without a proper ecological, environmental concerns may lead you and us into more problems. So instead of emphasizing only economic development, economic growth prospects, there is a need to balance it out and maybe also tune that down in favor of more ecological concerns. As you probably all know, there is going to be a World Congress in Copenhagen soon in December, where these issues are on the agenda, and every country, every government is trying to position itself in that regard. So my argument here is that genuine problems, genuine concerns, which were the core, the starting point of a certain period, historical or otherwise, may have led to secondary or spillover concerns which need to be addressed consequently. And when we look at information overload, especially in the Western countries, we are no longer talking about access to information. We have often too much information. We cannot handle all the information we get. We cannot get a grip on the type of news we are really looking for, or the kind of news which we need to make up our own mind. So there is a move away from scarcity to overload. And that needs other kind of mechanisms, other kind of teaching, other kind of handling than in the situation in the, which preceded that period, which was scarcity. Now for your country, you may still find yourself in between somewhere. You may think that you don't have access to all the information. As a result, you're still advocating for more information, more access to sources, but you may find yourself gradually in a situation that there is, again, an abundance, and then the question is not so much how to get to the sources, but how to handle that kind of abundance, that overload. So there's a challenge for both citizens, for us, as well as a challenge for public authorities. The challenge for citizens is how to deal with a permanent excess of information, how to deal with that overload once we have reached that stage. The challenge for public authorities, for government, is how to regulate this in a democratic way. And I think that we all agree that what the current, your government is doing is not always the democratic way you would like to see it applying. So there is room for discussion and room for innovation here. A third point I want to make, and again that's a very general point, from information society to knowledge societies. We have always been obsessed with news, information, especially in the West. We have always thought that information is power, is contributing to power. But we may start realizing that information is only one element of what we need to communicate among each other, to make sense out of our life and our environment. So therefore there is now a trend towards from information society to knowledge society. And there's also a trend to make that plural. It's no longer correct to state that we all have to become like the US society or like any other society you may have in mind. There are different ways to configure all of that. There is a plurality of access points, entry points to reach the stage of a knowledge society. But it definitely implies a number of changes in the way we look at this. The first point I want to make is that the most common definition of the information society, the traditional way of addressing this, is technological. So that's why internet is very appealing to you, because it's a technological facility which is new to most of you, or has been new to us. It takes more to configure it from a more social and cultural perspective, although that's what we should be trying to do, because technology is just a means to a certain end. It's not an end in itself, and technology is not value-free. You cannot adopt the technology from somewhere else and assume that the way you manipulate it is similar all over. It comes with a cultural baggage, as it's called. Therefore, and I highlight, or I elaborate a bit in the first point I make, what has happened in order to come to the internet age, to the information society age, is a convergence of different technologies, the traditional broadcasting technologies, the telecommunication, satellite communication, and the computer industry, the computer wireless communication, which have converged in what you could call the computer as an instrument, as a tool for the internet, or your cell phone as a wireless way to integrate all these facilities, because on your cell phone you can also download things, you can access the internet, you can send messages, etc. So it has become converged, it has become integrated, but at the same time it has led to a higher level of access and a higher level of mobility for the people who use these technologies. The second point I make is going away or moving beyond the technological perspective. We need to look at the information society in more cultural and social ways, and hence we to identify that by way of a definition, we should start talking about knowledge societies, knowledge and how we acquire knowledge, how we learn from each other and from the media and our surroundings is different or is more complex than the mere information process, the process which normally starts at the producer's level, at the level of a journalist who produces a story, the transmission through a medium, and the reception, you reading or watching that on your screen or on the TV or any of the other media available. So we should look at it as a holistic, as a more complex phenomenon where technology is only one component of the future society. So my fourth point tries to emphasize but also criticize it a bit. Technological determinism and convergence. As I pointed out, it's normally looked upon from a technological perspective, and that leads often to the belief that technology will solve all problems, that the transfer of a technology will contribute to something for the betterment of society. Sometimes that's definitely not the case. Sometimes it creates more problems than it solves. And hence my critique on what I call the technological deterministic perspectives in the literature and elsewhere. The innovative aspect of the internet is that it brings together two broadly defined separate facilities. It's not only broadcasting, so to speak, it is available to everybody, to the mass of people using the facilities, but it's also narrowcasting. It is narrowing it for specific groups among us. If you're not interested in learning more about, what should I say, Manchester United, you're not going to access the internet to find out what Manchester United is doing. If you're interested in the latest fashion trends, you will have another kind of niche which is not appealing to other people among us. So it is broadcasting, and it offers the opportunity to broadcast to a wide audience, but it is also narrowcasting. It limits and it focuses. It can create what is called in marketing terms the niche, which people have in common, a community of people sharing a same kind of interest or needs. However, as is usually the case with new technologies, it remains to be seen how much ICTs will be used on top of existing devices and or will gradually replace them. And even more important, whether the economic and or political powers would be in favor of such developments. What I mean by this is, and there seems to be a change or a development taking place which indicates that it is going to replace things rather than being used on top of things. But governments are always a bit behind the newest developments. They try to regulate and control these latest developments. Take, for instance, your own country. The way your government is trying to regulate the internet is still looking at it as an old-fashioned mass medium, as a way to control it at a source. While internet is so ubiquitous, so everywhere, and easy to circumvent and bypass, that central control is very difficult to achieve. I was told that you have developed your own version of YouTube, which is probably slower than the real version is, because you need to download and go through certain other providers or IP addresses. But in the end, you will get there where you want to get, because that's what the technology allows you to do. Now, a government who tries to control at the source is basically not only losing its time looking into the future, but it's also creating a very bad and poor image of itself, because it still tries to control where control is no longer in that dimension possible. Whether you as users will continue using all the other media, that's to be seen. There are people and theories which argue that we will use the internet next to our daily newspaper reading and next to our watching TV, etc. Now, newer research, especially among people like yourself, the newer generations, the younger people, indicates that you more and more will use your computer, your laptop, the internet as your home. And you will use that to do all the other media uses and facilities as well. American youngsters, they watch TV on their computer. They read the newspaper on their computer. They are no longer going to buy a newspaper or switching on their TV. That's something they leave for their parents to do. They are completely hooked on their laptop, and that of course creates issues with parents, because parents can no longer control what they are watching and what they are doing in their room or in front of their screen. So instead of that internet becoming a new medium next to other media, it seems as if it's going to replace the existing media. And that of course creates issues for the old media. Hence, a lot of newspapers in the US at the moment, they are losing, they're going bankrupt. Some of them have been closed, and even a newspaper which is probably also known around here, the New York Times, seems to have problems in staying in the market. They have tried to open their online versions, but their online versions are not as profitable as the daily print version. And the gossip or the rumor has it that they have been discussing this among themselves, and they need to come up with a conclusion or a recommendation in a year or two before they are faced with bankruptcy. So if it is already that serious for a paper like the New York Times, it's maybe even more serious for local newspapers and media. And that's what you see more and more. Many cities in the US no longer have a local newspaper, because that local newspaper can no longer survive on its own with all the facilities, media like TV, but also internet around. So the question then becomes, is the internet becoming as divided as the old media? Will we, as a result of all of this, get into the direction of a medium which is for the masses and produces all kind of, if I may use it in an impolite way, rubbish or pulp, versus certain segments of the internet which you have to subscribe to, you have to pay for, and these sites will remain to be quality. Now, I'm using these words a bit subjective, and you can fill out and you can identify what you consider to be pulp versus quality for yourself. So it's not that I want to suggest certain areas which are to be identified as popular versus more quality or elitist. But the question then is, will that be the end of the internet? Will that be the end destination of the internet? Because if that's the case, then we have another technological instrument which basically does the same as what we are watching, at least we in the West, on our TV screens, where you have a variety of channels, depending upon the city or the channel provider, but in the place I'm living at the moment, I can, if I pay for the service and pay for all the services, I can probably watch 200 or 300 channels at a time. So I can switch from one channel to another. And funnily enough, I hardly switch on my TV set because I think there's nothing on there worth watching. So most of what you see on TV these days, especially in the US, is commercialized entertainment. And news has become also commercialized entertainment. So for somebody, and you may have assumed by now that I'm not so much interested in that part of what TV brings, but more interested in documentaries, in feature stories, in something I can learn from. That is unfortunately only available on one or two of these 250 channels. So will that be the end destination of the internet? That you have a lot of access, a lot of quote-unquote rubbish, and only a few sites which you could access if the government would allow you to, for a price, which you had to pay for. And I'm not dreaming here, I'm not saying that this is the faraway future, because some sites already do it this way. The Economist, for instance, one of the, in my opinion, better Western weeklies, is now going to move from an online free site to a subscriber site. So you have to pay to access certain parts, more detailed parts of that site. So you can still get the front page with the general information, but if you are really interested in certain topics, if you want to read about, let's say, China and its future development in technology or something, looked at from the Economist, from an outside perspective, that is, you would have to pay for it. You would no longer get that information for free. So is that the future? I don't know, but it's worth raising as an issue. Now let's switch our perspective a bit, and let's look at it from a slightly different perspective. What has all of this meant for us? And that's, of course, the question about communities. Are we indeed living now in a virtual community rather than in a physical community? I think we are still doing both. We are still having our friends and neighbors with whom we play sports, and we go to school, and we have our chats and partying, etc. So that's the community we live in. But at the same time, we can establish a community of friends which is linked to us through online facilities, through the internet. We may have friends in, let's say, US and in Belgium and in Holland and in Africa, and we share a certain interest. We may all be interested in, as I used the example, Manchester United. So we may have friends who come together and form a virtual community on the basis of our interest in Manchester United. There's nothing wrong about that, but the question then is, will it take so much, or is it taking so much of our time that we will forget about our neighbors and our friends in the neighborhood? There are people who have argued back and forth about this. There were people who said that the internet and the new technologies will replace, and we will become more alienated, we will become more selfish, more individualized as a result. We will not pay too much attention to our friends or physical friends anymore. We will change our interactions, and we may also change our behavior, our attitudes, our appreciation for each other. We may become more competitive, or Western, if you want to use that word. There are other people who argue it won't work out that way. It will become much more of a balanced kind of approach, and we will continue having our physical communities as well as virtual communities. But it's still to be seen how they both will interact and how we can continue interacting in all these spaces. There is research done these days which indicates that all the talk about virtual communities is not so much of a new thing. Many people find themselves on the internet who also find themselves in the physical space. So if you if I look, and I'm now using my own example, but it's also supported by research. If I look how my kids, my daughters are using Facebook, most of their friends are the friends they go to school with. So they use the internet to stay in touch after school and share items, ask about homework, etc. So the virtual community is more or less the same as their physical community. And that might be the case for most of us. Although I'm sure that there will be Manchester United people who still have a very good relationship with somebody they never met before. So it's that kind of interaction which definitely also counts and will be explored in the future. So again, it's an open question, and I don't want to say it will go this way or that way. It's just something you better take into consideration. Another point 6 here, there are people who say, what is new about the internet? After all, we have always tried to communicate with each other, and we have always tried to come close to each other. Now, the internet allows this up to a certain point. It's not closeness in the physical sense. It's not touching each other as you do as friends or as mates, but it is a closeness and intimacy which you create in a virtual space. You can share ideas which you probably wouldn't share with your friends in an interpersonal communication. Internet, obviously, and certain forms of internet invites people to be more intimate with each other, sharing information which is more private, is more close to yourself. Now, some people say that has always been, in essence, an element of communication. That's why we learned to communicate as a human race. Initially, we started shouting to each other because we needed to communicate. We had to develop a language to communicate in and to create that kind of relationship. So, internet is only a next step in the search for closer relationships. I'm just giving it to you as another way of looking at it. I'm not saying that this is the only way to look at it. The people who are more in favor, more positive about the internet, they often compare it to with the term peer-to-peer. Is that a term known here? Have you heard about peer-to-peer communication relationships? If you haven't, and I checked this afternoon, you can go to P2P Foundation, P2P Foundation, and you find out what peer-to-peer all means. It's not blocked, so you can still access it from your computer. But basically what it means is a way to interact with each other which is much more horizontal, more equal, not hierarchical like we tend to do, or which we were trained to do in certain societies, including your own. So peer-to-peer means that all relationships have to be addressed at an equal footing, at an equal level, and that can lead to other forms of communication, relationships, but also other forms of economies. Economy which is not based on profit making, on competition, but an economy based on sharing, on maybe in a traditional pre-economic sense, bartering, exchanging goods, exchanging services to each other, without money transaction involved in the exchange. So people argue that the internet now will facilitate, will assist us in more equal relationships, in more balanced kind of interaction, more horizontal kind of relationships. So if it's looked upon from that perspective, they consider the internet a social laboratory, an experimental space to develop these and to try these out, because we haven't definitely reached that stage. There might have been a time when Marx was writing his books that he considered the ultimate phase of communism a society which was based on peer-to-peer. I leave it up to you to find out whether that has led us far in your own country or in other countries. Peer-to-peer is a specific form of a network which lacks a centralized hierarchy and in which the various nodes can take up any role depending on its capabilities and needs. Peer-to-peer is an egalitarian network, a form of distributive and cooperative intelligence. So it's more in line with what you probably have heard about the Creative Commons. Is that concept known to you? The sharing of software, the sharing of information without having to pay copyright and etc. for the sharing of it, because the software is not made by one person or one company, but it is made in an interactive way online through forms of interaction, of sharing. You contribute something, somebody else adds something else, and the outcome is something without ownership. It's a commonly created kind of product. And peer-to-peer advocates for this kind of production form. And as you probably know, there are already a number of examples available on the internet, sometimes good examples, sometimes troublesome examples. Let me take one example, Wikipedia. Who of you uses Wikipedia? Or is it also blocked? Okay, I see one hand, two hands, 3, 4, 5. Okay, so I assume that you know of the positive potential of Wikipedia, but you have also been warned about the dangers of Wikipedia, right? You know that Wikipedia is a work in process, that everybody can contribute. Even my dog, if he can type, could contribute. And the end product, what is made available, is not always correct, factual, as good as it could be. So you'll have to take it with a grain of salt, so to speak. You need to read between the lines. You need to check it off with a second source, or a source which could be the Encyclopedia Britannica or any of the other encyclopedias, which are more quote-unquote trustable because they are what is called in academic terms peer-reviewed. They are reviewed by a group of experts, and these experts say this is the right definition, this is the right description of that particular problem. In Wikipedia, everybody is an expert, and as a result, that may create problems in cases where there is really expert knowledge and expert advice needed. So, but that's the kind of example which is already with us, of a peer-to-peer network. Now, not only this kind of perspective, peer-to-peer, is definitely more egalitarian, more horizontal, more interactive, but it is also more difficult to control by powers that be, by political and other powers. So as a result, it cannot easily be manipulated. That's why Wikipedia is now trying to structure itself and limit the access to certain areas of its encyclopedic site, because it realizes that you cannot keep everything open, freely accessible for everybody if you want to come up with a good, trustable product. But in more general terms, that's precisely what is also happening on the internet at large. It's more difficult to control, to exercise control from a governmental or other kind of perspective. Now, I take a bit of a leap now into the direction of what would this all mean for those in power. As I said, internet is more difficult to control, more difficult to censor, and if it's being censored, it's very obvious, and you will have a lot of people like yourself complaining about this and protesting against this. Now, here I want to indicate that that's in itself not a new thing, that it has always been around. Because, as I point out, power is based basically fundamentally on two types of power. One very crude, visible power, the power of the gun, military power, that's power, right? That's what the Americans are using nowadays in many countries. But there's also a more subtle kind of power which is exercised. That's what you can call the consent of the governed, the acceptance of the power by those who are the subjects to the power. That's what governments try to establish, that you listen to the boss, that you accept what is told to you, what is explained to you, what you're instructed to do by the party, by the government, by the company, etc. So it has always been that kind of interplay between crude, obvious power and the more subtle kind of power which makes societies run. And that's not different from the past that has been around for ages. The question, of course, is how do you stay in power? How do you maintain power? And in a democratic system, in a Western democratic system, one has used the form of regular elections to give people the impression that they could participate to the power, to the election of the power holders. And up to a certain point, people have believed in that kind of system, so they believe, quote unquote, in democracy. That belief in those forms of democracy, in those forms of the exercise of power, is waning, is disappearing. People have become more cynical about this. They know that their governments are not always representing them, that they are not always speaking for them, that they are corrupt and bureaucratic and manipulative, etc. So it's not typical for an authoritarian regime or a democratic regime. The exercise tends to be different. The way it's being implemented tends to be different. Now, what from such a perspective one tries to achieve also in the area of internet, and again, your country could be used as an example, is again to continue that kind of exercise of power from the perspective of staying in power, remaining, continuing the status quo. But it is becoming more and more problematic, as I said, because you cannot control the final outcome of the internet. You can control certain access point to the internet, but not necessarily what is freely available through the internet. That's much more difficult to stay in power of and to control. But so my answer, my indication of an answer is again a bit ambivalent. On the one hand, there is still that attempt to create that kind of common view, that consent. On the other hand, there is alternative news, alternative information which slips in and which may contribute to a questioning of the common view, a questioning of the authorities, a questioning of those in power. So then the logical next question would be, will that lead to another kind of democracy? Will that lead to e-democracy, as it's called, an electronic form of democracy? Again, my answer is not straightforward. It's not that I would say, yes, it will. I'm not saying, no, it won't either. It's to be seen. And again, it has to be seen in the context in which it takes place. But what it definitely will initiate is more plurality. Plurality at the level of power centers, more parties, more So it will lead to more plurality of power centers, maybe more powers, more parties, more political affiliation, more democratic affiliation, more pressure groups, and that could be considered to be a good thing for our society and for our democracy. It may also lead to more plurality of information sources, more access to different opinions, different ways of looking at issues. But the alternative point is, as I pointed out, it may also lead to more of the same, more conformity. And again, I'm not saying that it will go in one or the other direction. But what it definitely will not lead to, and that's often what you read in people who are positive about this, who are advocating for e-democracy and the use of internet technologies for election processes, it will not lead to something like a Greek democratic model, because that is no longer achievable, that you create a room like this and that everybody has a say, and at the end of the evening we walk away with a conclusion everybody agrees to. That was the Greek democracy, at least how it has been explained and how it has been promoted, so to speak. What it would mean concretely is that all the non-Chinese in the room would not be included in the democratic process. All the females would be excluded. All, in the Greek terms, all the slaves were excluded. So you would end up with a much smaller kind of group which would be invited to participate in such a process. And given the proportion, the dimension of what we currently are experiencing, that's no longer achievable. So don't continue believing in romantic notions of e-democracy or in unrealistic concepts of democracy, not even achievable on the internet or online. That brings me also to the point I already mentioned, the meaning of knowledge. I said we have to move from an information to a knowledge society. Information is only a limited aspect of what is available through mass media, through mass communication. But we need to do more. We need to share experiences. We are eager to not only to get hard facts and factual information, we also need to be confronted with opinions of others, to make up our own mind, to make sense of what we ourselves believe in. So all this is referred to as knowledge rather than information. And as I point out here, knowledge is a sense that people make of information. It's not something like information which is transmitted into an empty head and consumed as if that head is going to be filled with information. It needs to make sense to the person who acquires, who receives that information. And that's another kind of interaction than a one-way interaction or a one-way stream, as it's often explained to be communication. Meaning is not something that is delivered to people, but people create and integrate it themselves. It's us, it's me, it's you who make sense out of your environment. And sometimes the information you are being given is nonsensical, is useless, is irrelevant to your own life and to your own opinion formation. So that's still a problem also on the internet. You may think that you will have access to more information, but much of that information may be irrelevant to you. You may enjoy it because it's presented in a very entertaining way, or it fills time for you, or you can play a game, etc. But if you really are self-critical and want to understand what have I learned here, what have I gained here, you may come to the conclusion that you've wasted your time in front of your computer. So again, the question then becomes, is this really the road to more egalitarianism? Is this really the road to a more horizontal, equal kind of society? Again, I'm still not willing to say yes or no, but I further problematize it here. But people who do believe in it, they think that by just exposing yourself to that kind of online world where you don't know whether the person on the other side of the email or the chat room is the person he or she pretends to be. Well, so you have all these kind of levels of trust you need to build up and incorporate in your perspective. And that in itself may lead to more levels of tolerance, more levels of interaction which you didn't have or hadn't learned previously in your in daily interactions with your friends, because you know whom you're talking to when you meet, etc. So there are people who say that there is a bit of a cyber-bureaucratic logic involved in the internet. The more I participate in the network, the more I promote the knowledge transfer, and hence the competitiveness of my own organization, company, and network. This means that the more you participate in such a network, the more you become visible. And you can use that for all kinds of reasons. You can use that for promotional, commercial reasons, but you can also use it to acquire the status of a learned scholar or a person who is knowledgeable about certain things. So it's another kind of status seeking, another kind of recognition, another kind of entitlement, which is the result of these processes. What is definitely true, and this is my next point, new forms of illiteracy, that we not only need to learn all of this, and most of you are much more fluent in acquiring these skills than I was. I was trained in so many years ago to read and write, and that's a skill in itself, but that's not the skill you need to be an internet blogger. You need other kind of skills, you need other kind of thinking patterns, you need other kind of engagement and interaction. And I don't know about the educational system here in China, but I guess that in general the education system here is not really up to speed to deliver those kind of skills and capacities, nor is it in the US or in other Western cultures. So there is a level of skills needed which are not yet taught, which are not yet considered and exchanged and discussed in educative kind of environments. Now maybe that doesn't need to be the case, because many of you who grew up with the internet, who the first thing you learned was probably accessing internet and learning to recognize visual signs, and before you could read, you already knew how to navigate, etc. So there may be a step which can be bypassed in the educative process, but it's to be seen whether that's the case. So there are people who are concerned about all of this, and that's hence I write here that there is a need for new forms of literacy, or to put it in a negative form, there will be other forms of illiteracy emerging as a result. People may be able to read and write, but they cannot use computers and visual communication in an appropriate manner. Another more troublesome issue is all the spam, the neuromarketing and the data mining involved in internet. It's you are all familiar with the way your government is controlling the internet, but in other parts of the world, including in this world, I guess, the internet is also being controlled by software companies, by marketing companies, by vested private interests, by the CIA, by your own government, as I said. So while you are thinking that you are behind your computer free and only focusing and accessing something worldwide which you only know about, forget it. Every computer has an ID and every computer can be traced. So even if you access sites which are not allowable or not accessible officially, and if you try to do that, somebody will know, somebody will register. There is a daily imprint made of all the communication taking place on the internet. So every day the internet is pictured, so to speak. Everything happening in cyberspace has a photo and a footprint. And not me, not you probably, but there are people, agencies, which have access to these footprints, who can trace it back, and that's how, if I may use the example, terrorists are being traced. How you can get back into history to find out who has been establishing links with others to do all kinds of things which are subversive or whatever. So it's a subtle way of control, but it is an omnipotent, it's an ubiquitous way of control. Don't think that because nobody sees you when you're typing your stories on Facebook or with a friend by email, that nobody else has access to what you are sharing. It even goes further, and commercial firms, they check your use of the internet, and after a while they know that you like to watch, what shall I say, an American talk show, or that you like to buy your clothes from the internet, or that you are interested in Manchester United. So, and as a result, you will be fed information about these things gradually. They may send you an invitation to become a member of a club which facilitates, which gives you discounts on tickets, or gives you a discount on the product you are looking for, or which gives you a free ticket to visit a place where you would have opportunities to buy all that stuff. So it's that kind of data mining. It is used by commercial firms to profile you as a user, as a consumer, and all this is done based on your own use of the internet. So once again, Big Brother is watching you. But let me conclude on a more positive note. What's the potential of the internet? The internet makes it possible to potentially reach large numbers of people for what is, compared to traditional mass media, a marginal investment. It doesn't cost too much to be have access and be accessible worldwide. So from a cost perspective, you can say, I'm willing to invest a bit of money for that kind of service, because no other kind of medium can provide me with that service. The internet is a major tool for the self-organizing of social groups as a result, and we see that alternative groups, NGOs, community groups who have genuine kind of social objectives, want to advocate for peace in the world, change the environmental policies of governments, and you name it, they use the internet quite effectively for that reason. It's not very costly and rather effective. You will probably have been invited from time to time to sign petitions or to donate over the internet. All these functions, all these activities are possible. This may both rebalance power relationships in the public sphere and perhaps lead over a certain time to another kind of society as a result. I say once again, may. I'm not guaranteeing you that it will. A move away from mass society towards a more localized kind of network society based on the coexistence of varied subcultures. So a society which is much more democratic, much more egalitarian, more multicultural, less authoritarian and less controlled as it's currently. Another important innovation of the internet is the collective discussion that it enables. So we can all participate in discussions, and that again creates more knowledge, more interaction, and makes us really participating in the discussions and in the decision-making process, rather than being the consumers and the subjects of decision-making. So, by way of conclusion, I think that it would be a waste, a missed opportunity if we would say the internet is not for us. We should not throw it away because it has some defects and some more problematic features. So from that perspective, I would say a properly defined democratic technology movement could actively develop democracy-enhancing tools. It's not replacing democracy, it's not creating something separate from the real world, real society, but it may contribute to a betterment, to a change process in the real world. It would actively fight to broaden the benefits of technology to all potential have-nots. It would actively fight to preserve our hard-won democratic freedoms in this new dimension of life. It could be used as an important additional tool for social change. Now, that's my first conclusion, but there is also another one, and that's a more balanced one. That leads to the title of my presentation. Francis Bacon, the English philosopher, used the term knowledge is power, right? Now, my redefinition of that term is the capacity and speed to access, retrieve, select, and reproduce knowledge will determine power in the 21st century. Thank you.
有两位同学提问的举手啊。
The question I want to ask is that, is there a limit to the ability of the internet that will limit the development of itself, or even worse, the development of the society?
If you take my point, I can't really say yes or no to that question, but I wouldn't say yes or no to your question, but I have tried to indicate that there's potential in the internet, and probably the internet as we know it today is still in the process of developing itself. If you are familiar with the new developments, the G3 broadband mobile technology, the fact that internet is now becoming the base for all kinds of technical facilities which may still be separate in your media consumption, then I would say there is still a lot to develop and to move to. But whether that will create more change for the betterment, for the democracy, for the other kind of betterment in society, that's to be seen. As I said, I'm not 100% positive. I'm trying to be more realistic in my assessment of the potential of the internet.
May I ask another question?
Okay.
The US is now developing, is now changing the rule of medical. It's the what to say?
Health policies. Okay.
Healthcare policies, but it is now a lot of people disapprove of it. We can look on it as the collision of old and new attitudes. My question is that, do you think should the internet lead the development of attitudes, or the opposite one?
again, it's not so easy to say yes or no again. I think you need to lower your microphone, otherwise we have that noise. Let me position, if you want to focus it, on the health issue in the U.S., the current debate there. I assume that most of you have a general idea of what's going on, right? You have a new president, President Obama, who promised better health care as part of his campaign promises. And there was a lot of excitement as a result. Many people voted for him because of that and because of a number of other promises he made. The assumption is that a new developed, what they call public health system is more in favor of the majority of the population. Majority of the population, of which 40 million out of a total of 230 million or so, is not insured in the US, and that basically means that if you're not insured, you have to pay for each doctor's visit. And for a regular doctor visit, that may not be too costly. That's about, depending upon the doctor, $100 for a visit, which is, by your standards, pretty expensive, I guess. If you're insured, it brings it down to $10, and the rest is being paid by the insurance company. But it becomes more complicated if you have a real health issue, if you have an accident and you broke your leg, or if you're diagnosed with cancer or something along those lines. Then of course you have to be treated in hospital and you have to undergo serious kind of prolonged treatments. And then the bill can be raised to sometimes $20,000, sometimes $100,000 for a heart operation or anything along those lines. And that's an amount of money an average person cannot pay, not here, but definitely not in the US either. The average annual salary in the US is about $35,000, which is not that high. If you read the newspapers, you know that there are people who also earn $2 billion a year or something along those lines. So the gap between the poor and the rich is much wider than in your country or in any country in the world. So that has to be taken into account. Now, the majority of the population, and there have been public surveys, public opinion polls done, the majority of the population is in favor of a new health system. They would like to see the current system replaced. Why? Because 40% of the price you pay for your insurance, to be insured, to get health, is not used for health issues. It's used to advertise companies, to promote companies, for the salaries of the owners of the company, for marketing, etc. So it's a very costly system, but of course there is one group of people who benefit from this, namely the insurers themselves, the companies who produce in the sidelines, medical facilities, medicine, etc. They want to keep the system intact. Now, although the majority of the population, through public polling, is in favor of a changeable system, Obama has problems in getting that through the parliament, through the democratic voting system. Why? Because these senators, they are being lobbied for by these companies to keep everything as is. And that lobbying, yeah, you can call it bribing, is so widely developed that it is a known thing, that it's even advertised. These senators, they have to advertise the amount of money they get from all these companies. But as a result, of course, they are not going to change their vote if they keep on getting the support and the money and whatever from these sources. And that's basically why you can have your questions about the democratic operation of a societal system like the US. I'm not saying that it doesn't have democratic potential and it doesn't work that it never works. There are definitely cases when it works. The election by Obama, who used social networking, has obviously generated a lot of excitement and has invited people who were previously not participating in a democratic process to the participation in such an event and such a process. And hopefully that will also lead to longer term kind of engagements with democratic participation. But there is definitely also an element to be worried about, and that's the role the Congress plays and the lobby groups, which are part of the Washington system, as it's called, in the democratic decision-making process. So whether internet can do something about that, I doubt it up to a certain point. Obama has used the internet for his campaigns, and he's still using it to generate support and raise issues. But traditionally, the mass media, the TV and radio channels, are the ones which are listened into by the majority of the population. No longer the youngsters may be tuning into the traditional mass media, but the bulk of the population, those who vote, they are still linked to these sources of information for their opinion information. So it may change on the long term, but it is definitely not contributing to major change at the moment.
First, welcome to our school. Can you give one or two examples in your work experience persuading us to live forward instead of Francis Bacon, especially when you are a young journalist? Thank you.
I didn't really catch your question. Are you saying that as a young journalist, what were the lessons from this statement? As a journalist, it would lead you to... Excuse me? What experience? Work experience for a young journalist. Yeah, I addressed this topic this morning in a lecture. As a journalist, I distinguish between three skills or three competencies you need as a journalist. One is what I would call the media-related competencies. The second one is the communication competencies. And the third one is the ethics of a journalist, the professional code of journalists. Now, the media-related competencies can be split up in two domains. One is the technical skills you need. The knowledge, the skills you need to write your stories, to compile your report and to broadcast your report. So that's more or less the same, the capacity to access, retrieve, select and reproduce knowledge. But you also need the other element of the skills, the understanding of how the network works, how the newsroom works, how you need to work in a context of the newspaper or the TV system, etc. And that's something you can learn at school, but you also need to acquire that when you are on the job, because every newsroom seems to be different. You may have an editor or an editor-in-chief who is a bit bossy or very authoritarian. Then you have to have another kind of relationship and attitude towards that person versus a person who is very open and acceptive and recommends you to explore things. So that is an element which definitely makes the skills not only to be explained and taught in school, but partly also acquired on the job when you are setting your first steps in the journalism environment. The second component is the communication competencies. And again, that is something you can learn, but you also have to update and continue learning about. Namely, it's the field you're trying to cover. If you are a sport journalist, you will need to learn everything about sports, the history of sports, the history of different teams, the techniques they use, the rules of the game, etc. So that's the context in which you operate. If you are reporting about the politics in this country, you need, of course, other kind of knowledge. You need to understand how the system works, where it comes from, etc., etc. So there are different competencies to be acquired depending upon the role, the function you are supposed to fulfill. The third part is the professional roles, the professionalism, the ethical codes. And again, that is something you can learn about, something you will be told about by your union, by your professional club. But it's also you who is the person who has to adjust yourself to that kind of environment. If you are very opinionated, if you are stubborn or having clear opinions about certain topics, you will probably have a bit of a hard time in a system which wants you to write according to the party line or according to certain set standards. If you are more flexible, that may leave you more leeway and room for experimentation. But what the difference is between the traditional perspective on journalism and the newer perspective as a result of these new technologies is that you have to be not only a journalist from 9 to 5 or during working hours, you have to be a journalist all the time, because all the time something may happen and you may be called upon for a report or for something. And then it becomes very important that you are capable to be there in time at the right moment, capable of wielding through the abundance of information to concentrate on the essence and present that in a way which is consumable, which is appealing to your readers or viewers. Does it answer your question?
I want to know more something that happened in your job career. Something in here, what experiences one or two things happened in your career?
No career.
Actually, the question she asked, she said that she want an example from your real life experience that when you was a journalist and when you was studying journalism. So actually, she wants to refer to his phrase with your real life experience. So she has a. Is it the same question? Yeah.
Yeah, I can think a lot of examples of my own life, but I'm now an academic, as you probably know, so I'm no longer in the field working as a journalist, but in those days that I worked as a journalist, I was covering, if you want to know, the Nicaraguan Revolution in Central America in the late 70s. And we had to interview people who we didn't like much, but because they needed to be interviewed and presented to our public. The situations of reporting under these kind of conditions changed much in the material, in the deontological sense of the word, but it has changed as a result of the speed in which it has to take place, the immediate, the instant nature of news these days. If you don't bring the news as first, if you don't walk away with the scoop, as they call it, you have missed an opportunity, and that has improved, that has fastened tremendously with the coming of new technologies. So you have to be more alert, you have to be more knowledgeable to know where the news is to be collected for your specific domain. But there is still a huge area which is not being covered because certain groups don't want you to cover it, certain countries or or issues are considered to be not interesting enough, and sometimes they become put on the agenda for very specific reasons. I assume that you will refer to North Korea, right? Why has that become an issue? Not so much because of what happens in North Korea, but because the interest the Americans have in North Korea, and probably also because they need scapegoats to create political dialogue in their own country. It's always that kind of finding the enemy in order to position yourself as the trustable guy.
Professor Sherris, your lecture must be brilliant, but it's really a pity that it's difficult for me to follow your thoughts completely. in my life experience, media always act two different roles. First, media give us information about the world out of our sight. Media tell us the truth and use its power to change something seems impossible to change. But on the other hand, some media tell lies too. They become the mouth of government. They tell people what government told them. Then they go against the democracy. What do you think of these two roles that media play, and how the media in Western countries get out of the control of government and tell the truth? Because I think sometimes the media in Western countries is more brave to tell the truth.
I'm sorry, but the speech you presented, your question was also a bit too fast for me. First of all, I apologize. I can't communicate in your language, but the PowerPoint is, as I said, made available or will be made available, so you can always go back and read it at your own time and speed. Now, as far as I understand your question, indeed the media, they play lots of roles, sometimes liberating, sometimes repressive, and that is not going to change. The only argument I added to the discussion is that the internet is more difficult to regulate and to oppress or control as other media have been in the past. So the role governments play in your environment, in your country, will have to be reconsidered, and the governments themselves will have to reconsider their role. They can no longer continue censoring and blocking things, because eventually there will be a technological way of bypassing this, and that will create, and I know that the Chinese government is very sensitive to this, a bad image for its country, for the government. So it's in its own interest, not only for the international community to change its policies in this regard and in no longer censoring or blocking things, but it's also in its own interest to create the kind of more liberal environment you as youngsters are advocating for. You want to be free, you want to have free access, maybe in order to find out that there is not much free on the internet, but then you have found out, you have made that choice, and you can come up with the conclusion yourself.
Thank you.
Yeah, clear.
I will just discuss the point that you okay. You know the point that you said that China has blocked some sites like YouTube and...
That's what I was told, and I experienced, yeah.
Yeah, but I think that in some countries, you know, people are still not mature enough to deal with information and communication technologies. And I think this makes them slaves more than free people. They will be maybe guided, and there will be channels transporting other, other organizations' IDs. And maybe without any bad intentions, this will
This is my idea. Governments have the right to guide information flow and close or open new channels that lead to new and safe knowledge, which help to make a real directive, then by result harmony of the country. Because I think there isn't any freedom or democracy in this country. And I think guided knowledge, which I call safe knowledge, in immature society makes power, or free knowledge in mature society makes power. I think this is my idea.
I can follow you up to a certain extent, and I have, I thought, indicated at the beginning of my presentation that there are different ways, different routes to heaven or to whatever you envision to be an ideal situation. I think that I can respect and accept your comment and your position, and if that works, and if you think it works, that's fine with me. But I tend to start from another kind of philosophical point, which is that we own the right to make that kind of decision, not our government nor any other kind of authority. But of course it has to be done in a concerted way, in a democratic way. We may disagree about all of this, but ideally speaking, we should be at liberty to make mistakes, but we should also have the right to exchange and dialogue with each other in a free way. I know that that's not always the case, that there is a law of control, censorship, not only in the known societies or the societies which are always classified as controlled by, let's call it, Western standards. The same happens in the West, but the kind of culture, the kind of sensitivity to these issues tends to be different, and it's therefore not needed nor possible to put everything under the same pattern or the same kind of perspective. But I think that I also have the right to make my own position known, and that's what I did.
As is known to all, Michael Jackson died this year. and in fact, he's pure, free, and kind. But many media told Michael that he was not so good. How do you think of this? How do you think of this accident? How do you think of this accident? How do you think of this phenomenon? How can the media prevent this event happen again?
Is this about Michael Jackson?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Actually,
why don't you answer that for me?
the question that he has, that I understand, that in the life of Michael Jackson, usually media put a critique on him, like the child abuse and other things.
Yeah.
So after the death, actually he wants to say that the media maybe is the reason of his death or his life problems.
Yeah.
So he wants to know either what is the role of media to highlight this kind of celebrities in making news. Is it the same question that
First of all, I've never paid paid much attention to Michael Jackson. Michael Jackson was is of my wife's and these days my kids' favorite singer. I'm more inclined to say Bob Dylan or Bruce Springsteen or any of these guys. But to answer your question, yeah, this is what American journalism has deteriorated to. It's all about commercialization, sensationalizing topics, and if it sells to critique a guy, and then afterwards, if it sells to promote a guy, they will not see that as a contradiction because it makes money both ways. It's a commodity, and it can be Michael Jackson one day and an earthquake the other day, or a bushfire, or anything along those lines. Everything is being commodified. Everything is turned into something which is sellable.
Although in China, the media sometimes restricted, but Chinese people now are willing to express their feeling and point out the problems in society. So do you think the popularity of internet in China is the landscape of the promotion of the democracy in China? Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, I think every society looks for alternatives and ways out of a structurally conservative system, and that's what internet offers to many of you. But in order to contribute to democracy, I would say you need to democratize the population. You need to bring democracy to your friends and relatives where you live in your community. And internet, up to a certain point, can link you to your communities, but you will probably have a problem in linking yourself to older people or people who are not so technology savvy as you and some others may be. So it's more important, I would say, to if you want to contribute to democracy, you would engage yourself in your own community with community work, with social mobilization, with protest demonstrations. That kind of activities might contribute to more democracy and more opening in your society. If it's only a click on your computer to say yes or no to a certain petition, that engages nobody. It has to be materialized in real terms. And for that reason, I don't know how widespread and how popular community media are these days, but in many other countries in the world, community media are looked at as alternatives for the mainstream oppressive media, because they still provide the space, the opportunities for people, for average people like you and me, to engage themselves, to participate, and to raise and to create their voice in opposition to the dominant voices coming from the mass media.
I have a program here, and I have two questions. First, can I copy your problem?
Can you
Can
what?
I copy your problem?
Yeah.
First question. And another question here. I just wonder one thing. As you know, the development of the technology here as the development of the technology. And the newspaper may be also today in the future. And as you know, yesterday's newspaper may be the history of today, right? And the internet cannot be saved for a long time. So if we want to know the history and the newspaper has disappeared, what can we do?
Do I summarize your question correctly if I say that it is, if the newspaper, the old print medium, is going to disappear, do we have an alternative for the newspaper? Is that your question? Yeah. The newspapers were all part of the historical period. They have fulfilled a certain role in society in the historical period. And most often they were the first means to educate people, to inform people about what was happening in their faraway environments, not in their immediate environment. Just like radio and TV and all the other media which have followed afterwards have partly functioned like this, but that's one function of the media, and maybe newspapers have more of a function in that regard, information and opinion making, than other media. For instance, TV is much more entertainment media. It's much more to entertain people rather than to inform people. But there are different functions media fulfill, and they all do that through a technical means. Now, in the case of newspapers, it's printing presses. And maybe the printing press has lifted its cause as the reproduction of daily news. Maybe we will move into the situation that our daily news is coming to us through websites online, and that at the end of the week we still will need or want to read a summary in a weekly magazine, in a print format, but not on a daily basis, but on a weekly basis. So I'm not saying that that will happen, but that might happen. So there is the technology is one way of looking at it. It's the function media fulfill: information, entertainment, mobilization, representation, and so on and so on, which are needs in society, and they will continue to be remain needs, but maybe under different disguises, under different formats, under different technologies.
Sorry, I want to ask a question. We know corruption is a very common phenomenon all over the world, right? And especially in China. And I want to know if the internet will be an effective way to control corruption.
The internet, like all the media, or at least certain media, they will publicize acts of corruption. They will point at misbehavior of governments, of people in authorities and power. So internet is fulfilling that kind of purpose as well. It's fulfilling that in a more wider dimension, in a faster pace. It ranks countries. There are institutions like Transparency International, which lists the level of corruption in societies and countries on an annual basis. And I don't know what society ranks first on the corruption axis. I know that normally one lists the European countries as less corrupt in that dimension. But whether internet can contribute to the abolition of corruption, I'm sorry, I am afraid the answer is no. Corruption is a phenomenon which is part of society, so you have to compete it, you have to fight it where it takes place, not at the level of reporting it. You may indirectly contribute to the abolishment if everybody is aware that, or is convinced that corruption should no longer be a standard way of organizing society. But that's a long-term process. I think that there are other mechanisms which need to be put in place, which are much more effective on the short term.
Thank you very much. The first one is it's not easy to get many detailed and advanced knowledge that in the internet, though it provided us plenty of resources. For example, can you give us your emails or your website for us to give us access to easy to contact with your accomplishments. And the second one is the internet in some ways contribute to the level of democracy in developing countries, especially in developing countries, because the ordinary people can enjoy the right to have a debate for the issues easily than ever. And in the country, they may have some rude and wrong arguments through the forums. Do you think the government should have a hand with the forums? And people's freedom of work and how to purify the environment in such the atmosphere. Thank you.
I'm afraid that I can't answer all your questions in the remaining time left for us. But what I would like you to do is go to this website here. It's www.csschange.org. That's the website of our research institute. And if you go down to the page and click the links page, if you go to the links page, you will have an overview of all kinds of websites and organizations which might answer some of the questions. There are links to UN agencies, there are links to news agencies, there are links to specialized agencies on sustainability, on environmental issues, etc., etc. So I don't want to avoid answering all the questions, but I think given the time of the day, it's easier if you can do it at your own pace. And I'm not saying that this is the best place to start, but you can copy it here, and I know it's still accessible from your computer at here to get to that page and to then go to the links page, the bottom of the page, and you will be given an overview of all kinds of organizations.
As everybody knows that our China has a very long history. So the traditional idea as a culture here has a powerful culture for so that do you think we students deal with this problem that political between traditional with modern internet culture and also our history.
Okay, one last question, I guess. Question about is there a conflict or a contradiction or a conflict between the traditional Chinese culture and the internet? I think that there's always a contradiction between culture and the use of media make of societal needs. And it always has to be looked at from these two perspectives. So the answer would be yes, there might be a conflict, given that the traditional culture tends to be more hierarchical than the internet promotes, but the specificity has to be looked upon in each particular case, I would say. And I don't think that we have time to go into much detail at the moment. I could, although I'm not specialist on China, I could send you to your teachers some reference, some documentation to explore that further.
结束，我们这个热烈的掌声感谢今天的演出。今天晚上在东九C103，然后我们的角色里会给我们讲另外一场关于泰国的艾滋病文化和传播讲座，欢迎大家去听，谢谢大家，谢谢各位长。
好。